So a quick introduction to who we are. My name is Claire Gonlick. I'm the CTO of Terbium Labs. Terbium Labs is a premier dark web data intelligence company. And we specialize in using intelligence from the dark web to mitigate risk for our clients.
So I'm Cathal Smith. I'm with RBC. So Royal Bank of Canada is Canada's largest bank and one of the largest in the world. Within RBC, we have a cybersecurity research group named Vanguard. And our focus is on looking at future threats and innovations in the cybersecurity realm.
As soon as we get started today, we're going to talk a little bit about what the principles that motivated our work today. The first principle is that data is an asset. Data has value. And because data has value to people and to organizations, it also makes it a liability. You have to protect your asset. And a lot of people in this room will spend a lot of time trying to protect that asset, but something we know, in particular here at Black Hat, is that defense, while necessary, important, even critical, is not sufficient. We take the approach and assume that exposure of proprietary data is inevitable. Data breaches are going to happen. No matter how many defenses you put up, no matter how much effort you put into prevention, things are still going to get out. And perhaps the industry that knows this more than any other industry is the payment processing industry, or credit cards. Despite massive investment to prevent and limit credit card fraud, credit card fraud losses still exceed $10 billion each year. And to make a bad problem worse, much of that money is funneled directly into organized crime and terrorism. So this is an extremely important problem, not just from a business perspective, but for society as a whole. And yet, combating credit card fraud is still a largely reactionary process. We'll talk more about what we mean by reactionary in a moment, but the work we're going to present today, we are going to demonstrate that we can do better, that there is another way to think about this problem where we don't have to wait to react to credit card fraud, but can actually prevent it. What does that approach look like? Well, it's an intelligence approach, and we call it data intelligence, kind of to contrast it with threat intelligence. And the idea is that your data is going to get out there, and in this case, payment cards data are going to be breached. People are going to try to steal them just in the act of using them. But if you track where that data ends up, if you use traditional intelligence methods to measure it and find it, then you can do something to mitigate the damage that that breach causes to your organization. So in the case of payment fraud, payment cards, a place where they often show up after they've been breached is on the dark web. And they're sold up, and they're sold in mass on the dark web. And by measuring and quantifying and gathering this intelligence from the dark web, we can shift from a very reactive approach to a proactive approach. And the best part about this is that this data fits in very perfectly with existing analytics and current fraud prevention approaches. So instead of being a huge and different approach with a high lift to implement, it fits directly into existing state of the art. So what is the current state of the art? And I will pass it over.
So, excuse me. Right. So in traditional point of compromise detection, you have some known compromised cards. There's multiple ways you can find this out. You yourself get enraged when you get charged $500 for an ebook on Bitcoin that you obviously never bought or something. Or maybe the bank has a machine learning algorithm that tells you that this was a fraudulent charge. Or a third party like Visa or MasterCard gets in touch and says, look, we think this is a fraudulent charge. So we know that this is traditional. We know that these guys are the victims of some kind of fraud. They also have some transaction history, so we can figure out their common points of purchase. So these are all the stores that these victims were shopping in. And then, excuse me, through cross-correlation, we can figure out, well, which is the actual point of compromise. So here we see the victims all attended cross SS fit, and their data was stolen. Okay, so that's the traditional way, but there's a problem with this method. There's two ways that you basically find it out, right? You either have your victim of fraud, where in that case, then money is lost by the merchant or by the bank, and credit card information is stolen along with our slides. Okay, but then you get it back. So it's only a brief blip. Or you could, excuse me, go online and buy those credit card numbers yourself to figure out who is being compromised. But either way, you're feeding money into the criminal economy. We don't want to do that. So we're taking an approach where we don't want to feed money in. But in doing so, we are dealing with more uncertainty. So now, instead of knowing who the victim is, we have groups of candidates for each potential victim. And even still, even with this uncertainty, like that, yeah, even when we're in the dark, we're able to make some inferences as to who actually, where the point of compromise actually has occurred. So we get these candidate groups from this dark web intelligence. So, you know, the guys who committed this data breach, they know what store it was. They know it was CrossFit, Cross SS Fit. I'm not actually trying to get myself sued here. And they will list, you know, some detail, such as the BIN, the bank identification number, where they're putting the card up for sale. So we take that information and we build up our candidate groups. And then we make some inferences as to who the victim is. There's one more thing that we do, because of this uncertainty, we're going to need a control group to make sure that, you know, we're not pointing the finger at the wrong guy. So this control group then is there to kind of vouch for all the other stores that, you know, they're quite popular, but they're also popular amongst the control group, so forget about them, they're fine. Okay. So this is just a classic big data problem, right? You have a lot of victims, they have a huge transaction history, and you're trying to correlate all of their histories together. And so, you know, it's a classic problem, so we have classic solutions. We're using a very traditional approach. There is a paper that came out a couple of years ago called breach radar, which is just, it's a Bayesian likelihood estimation method. So, you know, we don't really need the slide, so I can just tell you about it. Just imagine, right, you basically start up with some prior on all of your merchants. You believe like some merchants are more likely than others, okay? So maybe you just spread the blame across everybody initially. Then using whatever evidence you have, such as the transaction history, you start updating that blame until you end up getting to some stabilized posterior, right? It's just a little greedy algorithm that just alternates back and forth. It's very simple to use. You can do it in some MapReduce framework. So it's you know, it's tried and trusted. Problem here is that we are now adding in this uncertainty. But you know, we can still use this tried and trusted method. We're just augmenting it, and we just have to get around this problem. The problem being that when you add in this uncertainty, that now we are trying to find the right combination of clients across, you know, possibly trillions of combinations, okay? So, I mean, this is really like finding a needle in a haystack. So what do you do when you want to find a needle in a haystack? Well, you burn it down. Just set that thing on fire. So there's a lovely animation of it on fire. So just imagine yourselves. Okay. Right. So there's just different thresholds that you can do to get rid of this data. We can say that, you know, say that it's basically a popularity contest. Say that the merchant is very, very niche and only one group has attended this merchant. So that group represents one possible victim, none of the other victims. So if only one group has attended it, clearly it's not one of the merchants that you care about, okay? Or maybe it's too popular, you know, like the Amazons or whatever, or Netflix. Everybody has a Netflix account. And so therefore the control group, lots of people have accounts there. It's not the point of compromise. Or maybe it's super unpopular and nobody goes there, nobody buys it, super uncool, not likely to be our victim. Okay, so let's have a look at a case study. This is actually using transaction data and using dark web intel, and we were able to find a fairly large breach. Right, so we used this dark web intelligence. We had a point of compromise that was spread across 10 different batches on these card shops. We didn't know that they were correlated at first. We did not know the point of compromise either. It had affected a large number of clients. However, we did know that a lot of these clients were Canadian. And so therefore, we figured that the business was probably Canadian as well. Okay, so This figure here, this is our probability distribution for the merchants and the likelihood that they were the point of compromise. So on the x-axis, we have the merchants. The merchant here really refers to the merchant name, the point of sale terminal, and the week of any transactions. So on the y-axis, we then have the likelihood. So you can see that our number one spike, that has a probability of about 0.04%, which might seem small, but that is 60 times larger than random chance, and it's twice as large as the second largest group. But we can't just call it a day and say that this point of compromise, which is a restaurant chain, we'll call it Bob's, we can't be 100% sure, so we need to look at some secondary evidence. So this secondary evidence is, well, let's look at a time profile of this risk. So this is the risk for Bob's from July up until September. And you can see in July, there's zero risk. Bob's is fine. But I would really recommend not going to eat there in late August because trust me, it spikes up to about 0.04. Let's see, okay, there we go. I think if I just keep hitting this, it wakes up. Okay, so yeah, this is a really good indicator that the victim or the point of compromise is Bob's, because we're seeing this repeated spikes in this short time window. So, the algorithm doesn't build in any kind of temporal coherence. So the fact that we're seeing that is a very strong indication that this is also our victim. Another secondary piece of evidence we can use is the transaction data. So we've got two figures here. On the left is the transaction data for Bob's, and on the right is for our second most likely candidate. This is a popular online digital store. Let's call it Gappelzon. So on the left, we have Bob's, and in both figures, we have two curves. We've got the transaction curve in blue, and we've got the group spread in orange. So the transaction curve is just the number of transactions made by candidates that week. The group spread is the number of groups that have interacted with that merchant. So when the point of compromise occurs, you actually want these two curves to be as close as possible, because that means that there's only one candidate in each group that has shopped there. So while the digital store is a lot more popular, you can see that the blue curve is usually way larger than the orange, so it's very unlikely to be our point of compromise. So using this information, we were able to confirm that this was a point of compromise. We were also using historical data, so I was able to go back, talk to the fraud department. They were like, yep, that was a point of compromise. And we really do feel like this method works with very, very large and messy data. So I'll pass it over to Claire for the conclusions.
Okay, so the takeaways from this message is that traditional fraud detection is reactive. And by that, we mean we wait for fraud to occur so that we can identify specific or attempted fraud to occur. So we can identify specific accounts and then begin our mitigation techniques. You don't have to wait for that to happen. You can start the moment that the criminals try to monetize or build their business online using dark web intelligence. And this is a big win because more than just preventing fraud, you are actually stifling the criminal economy by stopping money from feeding into that system that is propagating this business and creating a systemic risk. The second takeaway from this is that this is not a method to prevent a point of sale breach. This happens starting with the assumption that some amount of data loss is inevitable. That does not mean that defensive measures where you're trying to, chips and other measures are not important. They're very important at reducing fraud. But even with all of those measures, some information is still going to get out there, and you still have methods of mitigating that damage after it occurs. And this is what we call the dark web data intelligence approach. And the other really important message to take away is that this is really a small shift in the way that you think about traditional common point of purchase analysis, as opposed to a dramatic new algorithm. And that's a win because it means that it is easy to implement and widely accessible for the entire industry. And one of the things about combating credit card fraud is it really is an industry-wide problem. that would benefit from a lot of collaboration across the entire industry. And so one of the reasons we're presenting this approach today is to encourage you to come talk to us about how you can make this, you can make these changes and implement this strategy in your own organization. And I think that's it.
Yeah.
I think we're ready to open up for any questions.
So,
Despite
so we'd like to say thank you to our colleagues, Danny Rogers, CEO of Terbium, Corey Fong, who's the head of research at Vanguard, it's RBC, and Daniel Sperfinger, who helped us out with the fraud details. Yeah, so despite all the interruptions, we still managed to kind of blaze through that. So we'd love to get any questions from you guys at all, and anything at all.
Thank you.
Yeah. RBC is cool too. Yeah.
How much more difficult is it when you find those in the dark web? They're not one compromise, they're multiple compromises and different sources up there together. So that kind of blows away your algorithm if you're looking for one, when it might be 10 or 15 is compromised.
So the question was, how do you deal with dark web intel when it's basically multiple breaches all swimming together in one happy family? You don't make the assumption that it's only one breach. And while it might have seemed like we did, in this case, that we only had one breach, we aren't making that assumption. So you have to be careful with basically the thresholds that you use. And then the algorithm doesn't discriminate either. It can predict multiple POCs. And so you look at your top whatever candidates, you look at the behavior of that data. Again, the group spread and the transaction curves, like they should still be intersecting more or less. So you can still make inferences when there's multiple breaches that are mixed in together. So yeah, and we have come across that. Yeah. Yeah.
So once it's up on the dark web, can be monetized pretty instantaneously. I mean, how long is the window for this kind of preventative stuff to really work before you have the exact same problem you already did, but it's out there and being used?
So we are, right now this is a proof of concept, but when it's fully implemented, it can be automated end to end from the data collection to the analysis. And the data collection can be fully automated and collected almost as fast as the information can be found. And then on the transaction side, the algorithm can be run distributedly and can converge within 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, so I mean, in the traditional POC detection, it's still actually incredibly fast. Like, I really am impressed with how fast, and I'm honestly, half the time I was competing with Daniel to find a POC. But even still, we can still get an edge on them. And within 30 minutes, for one very large breach where it would have taken them a couple of days to be very sure, because you have to, basically, you form a hypothesis by looking at victims, and then you wait to confirm that hypothesis. Where in this case, you don't have to wait. So we would have found it within 30 minutes.
That's making the assumption those cards are put in use relatively quick after the compromise. If they plug something in at a gas station, they collect data for 4 or 5 months, then dump them. It'd be a lot harder to stop them if there's not any indicators out there yet.
Yeah, so we don't make assumptions on when the point of compromise occurred, right? We usually we look at a history of like 2 to 3 years within the lifespan of a credit card.
You're not going to stop them if they're dumped all at once. Or if they're gradually, you can see it.
Oh.
So yeah, the question is like, how do you think about the delay between when the cards are actually breached and when they might actually appear for sale? So this is a risk mitigation. So one of the things that in some cases, the breach is ongoing, in which you might actually be able to prevent further breaching. But you can also just get a heads up on your mitigation attempts, which means if it's a large breach and the card's very fresh, you might want to start reissuing. You might want to start notifying customers. You might want to feed this directly into your real-time transaction algorithms. Like there's lots of different ways you can act on this data, given the fact that our point of prevention comes at the moment that they try to mass monetize this data, as opposed to keep it very close to their chest.
A question on your left.
Left, sorry, oh yeah, sorry, really bright.
Given that this model is kind of nascent, have you considered any mitigations criminals might take, such as commingling data from multiple breaches or withholding cardholder information in certain quantities from breaches to make this harder as it gets more popular?
Do you want to-
Yeah, so we have been very careful with exactly how we presented this data today because we agree with that. So sorry, repeating the question, it was, can't the criminals just overcome this method? So that we think of it on two levels. One, some of what we are observing are their ways of advertising to their customers. And so this is how they make money off their business. And so if we force them to change their methods, they're moving into less and less effective methods. And in some ways, when you think about an intelligence approach, that is part of the goal. So we're careful, one, about our sources and methods and specific details so that we can, still perform this methodology, but also keeping in mind that stifling the economy, even if it requires them to change their methods, is still the goal of how you approach solving credit card fraud.
How could you generalize this proactive method to other industry like manufacturing or other industries?
So when you say other industries in like manufacturing, you mean fraud that occurs in manufacturing? Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know exactly how the two methods overlap. I very much am just a nerd who deals with transaction data. But I mean, we're certainly we're interested in looking at other things involving, say, cryptocurrencies, but we're nowhere at a stage where we can talk about that yet. When it comes to other industries and fraud, yeah, it's a good question. I don't know yet.
Yeah, I think the thesis that motivated this work is generally applicable, which is that data is valuable, defense is necessary and important, but not always going to be sufficient, and that data is going to leak. So if you take the approach of measuring where that data is and who's using it and how they're using it, then you can still think about using this data intelligence approach to prevent some sort of damage that might occur to the businesses. And I don't think that common point of purchase specifically necessarily generalizes to other industries, but the thesis behind the work, I still think has a place. It's a good place to start.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're done.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.